Welcome to the 2021 Nanaimo International Jazz Festival. My name is Natasha Hoskins. I'm a drummer and board member for the Nanaimo International Jazz Festival Association. Because of the obvious challenges with coronavirus, we will be presenting our festival online from March 1st to March 20th. We have 9 great performances over the next 3 weeks, all because of generous funding from Heritage Canada and the City of Nanaimo. Enjoy the show. Dazzling pianist, arranger, and musical director, Nico Rhodes gains the attention of audiences and musicians alike, whether touring with his jazz trio or performing solo.
Hello and welcome. My name's Nico Rhodes, and I'm here to share with you some of my favorite music. It's timeless music, predecessor, an ancestor, if you will, of jazz. This first piece is the Maple Leaf Rag. Now, a lot of you might know this piece, hearing your kids play it on the piano at home or someone playing it in the music shop. But this piece was actually quite remarkable. This was Scott Joplin's second published composition. And it sold over 1 million copies of sheet music before it was all over. So it took this young, itinerant African-American composer living in the sort of the Midwest and in the South from Texarkana, and it shot him right into stardom. And so this piece is remarkable for a lot of reasons. Joplin himself actually said to his friend Louis Chauvin when he was writing it, he said, "When I finish this piece, it's going to make me the king of ragtime." And he was right. So this is Scott Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag. So A lot of people, when they think about ragtime, think about that first piece, the Maple Leaf Rag, or maybe The Entertainer, which I've been told not only appears in the Ice Cream Music song, but it's even part of a new Red Bull commercial involving a banana peel and a skateboard. Long story short, I digress. There's so much more to this magical musical world. These composers really bridged an early gap between classical music and what would quickly become jazz. That bridge was later formalized with other composers like Duke Ellington, George Gershwin, and many others. But it's an interesting space to live in. And what's so incredible and wonderful about Scott Joplin in particular, the reason why he is the king of ragtime, not only did he have a tremendous melodic sense, but he had an innate musical curiosity. You can see, if you follow his musical progression over many years, you can see this incredible development over time. This next piece, Gladiolus Rag, really illustrates that. Now, I put it next to the Maple Leaf Rag for a very explicit purpose. The first two sections are actually a rewrite of the original Maple Leaf Rag. You'll hear the similarities in the progression and the rhythm, but the mood of the piece is completely different. And once you hit the third and fourth strain, it's a whole different musical universe. So this piece really illustrates Joplin's musical development from sort of classic, saloon ragtime, where unfortunately was one of the few places these musicians would be allowed to be played due to predominant racist attitudes at the time. This shows the beginning of what would later be sort of classic ragtime. So this music starts to bridge the gap between concert, romantic music, and the beautiful African American tradition, rhythmic tradition that is ragtime. The lives of these composers were fraught with all sorts of difficulties, hurdles, obstacles. Not only was this a difficult time economically for musicians, as I suppose a lot of times are, but these musicians, particularly those of the ragtime tradition that were African American, who were black, they faced a lot of hurdles, particularly in the sense that they weren't allowed to perform in major concert halls, they weren't accepted into major conservatories. A lot of these musicians learned on the fly. Scott Joplin himself was a young prodigy. At age 11, he was improvising on the piano after but a few piano lessons and creating his own compositions. He was given free piano lessons by a local old German man who sort of heard about him and scoped him out and decided that he was someone who needed to be taught. So a lot of these musicians gained their information, their knowledge, and their experience by chance, by generosity, and they had a really strong community. There was a community in the performing sector. The Maple Leaf Rag itself was actually named after the Maple Leaf Club, which was a place that allowed Joplin and other composers to play their music. And there was a lot of interaction between these musicians, much like later on in jazz history when you have musicians getting together and having jam sessions and cutting sessions and all this sort of stuff, sharing vocabulary. That was already taking place in this world. And a lot of these musicians would hang out till 3, 4 in the morning after playing and share all these ideas that they were coming up with and concepts and techniques. And this next piece really illustrates that generosity in that community. There was a young Creole composer by the name of Louis Chauvin. He died, tragically, he passed away from syphilis, which actually claimed a lot of lives of these composers. And he was apparently a brilliant improviser. He could rattle off these majestic rags, 6, 7 strains long, just variation after variation after variation. But he didn't write anything down because, you know, that took too much time. And so we have very little written record of him. But the story goes that this next piece, Heliotrope Bouquet, written by Louis Chauvin and Scott Joplin, was the product, the birth of their meeting late in Chauvin's life, months before his death. And apparently Chauvin played the A theme and the B theme, the first 2 sections, for Joplin, but they were incomplete. And Joplin asked if he could finish the piece, offering a C and D section themes to sort of round off the whole piece. And they published it together under their name. Unfortunately, Chauvin never really lived to see this piece achieve the attention that it deserved, but his legacy lives on in this beautiful melody, Heliotrope Bouquet, a drag 2-step by Joplin and Louis Chauvin. Thank you so much. Joplin not only wrote ragtime in the concert piano sense, he also wrote popular songs, novelty tunes, and 2 operas. Now, it's commonly known that he wrote 1 opera, but he actually wrote 2. His first one was seized in a financial dispute and was never recovered. Apparently, those people who took it lost it. 400 pages of written manuscript, full orchestra, chorus, and piano. Lost to the ether. Thankfully, our dear Mr. Scott Joplin would not be deterred, and he wrote a second opera called Treemonisha. It dealt with African-American folk songs and folk stories, a predecessor to the American tradition of musical theater, featuring an all African-American cast 100+ years before the modern hit Hamilton. So this goes to show how forward-thinking and how spirited this gentleman was. He understood the humanity of all people and was encouraging people to look beyond their prejudices of the time. One of the pieces I'd like to play for you today, this next one, Bethina, it's not from his opera Treemonisha, which was a flop initially, but later he received a Pulitzer Prize for, and it was received with great distinction after it was performed by the Atlanta Symphony in Georgia. This piece illustrates sort of his musical concept for the opera in a piano sense. It doesn't feature the normal 4 strains that a rag has. It has 6 strains. It modulates through half a dozen keys, and it's a concert waltz, a syncopated waltz. And this piece has a particular story. Joplin was married 3 times. His first marriage was very tumultuous, but his second marriage to his sweetheart, Freddie, was apparently one of the joys of his life. Unfortunately, after they were married, they were traveling back to Sedalia by train, stopping along the way to play concerts. And she grew very ill, feverish, and by the time they got back to Sedalia, 10 weeks later, she passed. She was in her late 20s at the time. He wrote the piece Chrysanthemum Rag for her for their wedding, and after her passing, it's suspected that he wrote this piece in dedication of her memory. This is Bethina, a concert waltz for Freddie. Thank you so much. Scott Joplin obviously was not the only great ragtime composer at the turn of the 20th century. There are a plethora of composers. Artie Matthews, Arthur Marshall, Tom Turpin. His Harlem Rag actually was one of the first published rags. But the three sort of the main guys, the Brahms, Beethoven, and Bach of ragtime, were Scott Joplin, James Scott, and Joseph Lamb. Joseph Lamb was a self-taught piano player from Chicago. He grew up watching his older sister, who was a concert pianist, and picked things up from her as they went along. But he was nuts about ragtime. And as fate would have it, he was in the Chicago or New York office. Forgive me, I forget. But he was in one of the offices of John Stark and Sons, who they were Scott Joplin's publisher from way back when in Sedalia. And he came in to purchase the latest Scott Joplin rags. And when he arrived, he was talking to John Stark, and he said, you know, I actually write my own rags. He's about 19 years old, 20 years old at the time. And John said, oh, well, is that so? Yes, I think they're pretty good. He goes, well, why don't you walk over there and ask that guy? And there's a gentleman sitting in the corner. So Joseph Lamb goes over and sits at the piano and plays his sensation rag for who else but Scott Joplin. Of course, he didn't know that at the time. Joplin, right there and then, he stamped his name on it. He said, listen, we're going to put arranged by Scott Joplin on the sheet music. It'll sell better. You get all the royalties. And come back with some more. And Joplin told Scott right there, Joplin told Stark right there that he should publish all the future rags of this young pianist. And he did. He went on to fill his catalog quite thoroughly. Joplin was good to his word. Joseph Lamb was properly paid. He received a $20 check in the mail the next week, and his luck would continue from there. He has a very different style from the other members of our trio, James Scott, Scott Joplin, and Joseph Lamb. He has a certain element of romantic morbidezza. I think he acquired this from listening to his sister play Chopin growing up. In fact, this piece has elements of a Chopin etude in it, which I only realized because I was playing the Chopin etude and this piece on the same day and kind of looked at them. And I hope you enjoy this next piece, the Ragtime Nightingale. Thank you so much. This next piece is called the Don't Jazz Me Rag. My understanding is that it's called this because early jazz musicians had a habit of improvising on ragtime composers' pieces. And although I'm rather fond of doing this myself, apparently certain ragtime composers did not take kindly to this practice. Nonetheless, this next piece is composed by James Scott, not to be confused with Scott Joplin. Oh, so many Scotts. But James Scott was a young African-American man from the central Midwest, and he was born of two emancipated slaves. That's how recent those times were in America. And he was known as the Little Professor. His cousin used to describe him as, he would always wander around buried in thought, his head down, books in hand. Apparently he was a very intense and productive individual. He was a music teacher, a music director. He played piano and organ for silent movies. He was a composer. He ran several choirs. So, quite the gentleman. His music, he had a similar sort of story as Joseph Lamb. He met Scott Joplin in St. Louis, and Joplin recommended his music to John Stark as well to be published, which sent his career off. His first publication was the Frog Legs Rag, which actually was second in sales, sheet music sales of all time at that moment, only to the Maple Leaf Rag by Scott Joplin himself. He has a lot of energy and percussion and movement to his music that I really enjoy. He's also he's a little bit more technically demanding than the other two. In general, he seems to use the whole piano, and you hear that sort of intense forward motion his cousin was talking about. So this is the third member of our ragtime trio, James Scott, and his Don't Jazz Me Rag, subtitled I'm Music. I'd like to take a jump through time. Ragtime, after its heyday in the early 1900s, sort of gave way to the swing era, to music out of New Orleans, Louis Armstrong's Hot 5-7s, Jelly Roll Morton, all those guys. And some of these early pioneers of this tradition, it became sort of outdated. Often this music was portrayed with a sort of novelty, sort of looking back with nostalgia, and it was often referred to as novelty song, played on pianos that were, purposely out of tune with tacks and pins, trying to make it sound like an old saloon piano. And sort of the seriousness of the music as an attempt at a formal composition was sort of set aside for a while. Although the great musician James P. Johnson, when speaking of Scott Joplin, and his compositions, once referred to his piece Euphonic Sounds and said, who even understands euphonic sounds? It was 75 years ahead of its time. For you jazz fans out there, the progression giant steps can actually be found in some degree in the B section of Euphonic Sounds. So who knows, maybe Coltrane was checking out Scott Joplin. Long story short, too late, in the 1970s, a ragtime revival took place. There was the Marvin Hamlish score to the movie The Sting, which featured an all-Joplin musical score reorchestrated. There was the Redback book. There was the CD by Joshua Rifkin. It took me a second. Which he actually was awarded. He was nominated for Best Classical Instrumental CD. For his performance of Scott Joplin's Rags. So that's how sort of in between the lines this music is. It's being nominated for classical Grammy Awards. But there was a young composer named William Bolcom who picked up on this craze in the 70s while he was studying at Juilliard. And he was an avant-garde composer, mostly into serialism and atonalism, Stravinsky, all sorts of crazy stuff. But he caught the ragtime bug and he started writing huge amounts of ragtime. In fact, he stopped writing anything else. And he wrote this next piece, The Last Rag, to be exactly that. He had decided that ragtime had derailed his musical ambitions. He was becoming obsessed. And so he set to set it aside with this last rag. Thankfully, he failed. And although he composed many pieces, symphonic works, and operas after that, he continued to write rags. This is a beautiful ballad which shows what a modern hand and some Juilliard training can bring out of the style. It's really quite a tip of the hat to the lyricism of Joplin and Lamb and James Scott and all those towering giants. But it's nice to hear the music 60 years later being reinterpreted and reimagined by the great William Bolcom. This is his Last Rag. I have a very special relationship to this music. I grew up playing a little bit of everything. I grew up on tour with my mom, who's quite a renowned chanteuse. Um, and I had the fortune of some incredible music teachers along the way. My good friend Doug Dodd got me started off. My incredible classical piano teacher, Jackie Rhodes, one of my late great jazz piano teachers, Bob Murphy, as well as some fantastic saxophone teachers, Jack Stafford, Steve Jones, Phil Dwyer, amazing people in my life who really gave me a lot of opportunities. But one person who kind of had an interesting effect on me was my dear friend Phil Posner. And Phil was my mom's sound man. Phil was the kind of guy who would just, he was filled with interesting ideas. Still is, thankfully. Hi, Phil, if you're watching. And he would send me off with DVDs of, or VHSs at the time, of Charlie Chaplin movies, or 5 seasons of Star Trek, The Next Generation, or Beethoven string quartets, or Mozart symphonies, 30 through 39, just to go and try something out. One of those things that Phil, encouraged me to just try out. For the record, I'm a massive Trekkie. I love Charlie Chaplin, and Beethoven's my favorite composer. So clearly Phil has had an impact on my life. But the one thing that he really, one of the most lasting impacts he had was introducing me to ragtime. My piano teacher, Doug Dodd, had the complete works of Scott Joplin in a book about this thick. And, Phil saw that one day and he pulled it out and he said, have you ever heard of this music? It's incredible music. It's a predecessor to jazz. It bridges classical and improvised music. It's a predecessor to stride piano, which I was super into at the time. Still am, actually. And he said, you gotta check this out. And I kind of, I played a couple pieces and, oh, that was nice. But it stuck with me. And a year later, I was living in Vancouver, and it was the fall. No, it was the spring. Oh my goodness. It was the spring, and the cherry blossoms had come out. And I was walking through East Vancouver, out of my little apartment, where my music office was, a keyboard underneath a cement staircase, which was freezing cold, damp, and I'm pretty sure I had some rodent friends that would hang out with me, but it was a very creative time in my life. And I thought it was best to get some fresh air, so I went outside, and the cherry blossoms were falling down. And I ran home, and I wrote the Cherry Blossom Rag, which was my first ever, ragtime composition. I sent it to Phil, and he said, that's really great. You know what you should do? You should just play through all that Scott Joplin I gave you and really formalize your understanding of the music. I took that to heart, and that night I spent 9 hours playing Scott Joplin. I finished at 5 in the morning, and I played through every single Scott Joplin piano piece he ever wrote in one sitting. Well, I stopped to go to the bathroom, obviously. But other than that, I know, too much information, I absorbed that music, and I could not stop after that. Throughout the years, I would constantly go back and replay and re-examine and seek out new compositions. A couple years later, when I was back in Nanaimo, my ex-girlfriend, her mom had a terminal illness, terminal cancer. And she was gracious enough to have us there with her. We were sort of watching over her and taking care of her. And she was having, obviously, a very difficult time. And I wanted to do something to cheer her up. She loved color, and she loved reality TV, particularly Survivor, and she loved music. So I decided to, paint her a musical picture. And I went into my office and spent about an hour composing this next piece, which I presented to her and is dedicated to her, to Sandra Lawrence. This is in memory of her, and this is a new day, because that day she had found out that the treatment that she was on was working, and she was granted extra time with her family. So she was given a new day. So this is a musical picture for you, a New Day Rag, for Sandra Lawrence. Thank you so much. I hope that you enjoyed this musical journey that we've been on. I hope that you gained new insight and appreciation for the composers and for this music, for its place in history, for how it pioneered some of these early musical concepts and vocabulary that we hear so much in modern pop music, in jazz, and all around us. I am grateful for the opportunity to play this music and to interpret it and to learn more about it every day. I also want to thank the Nanaimo International Jazz Association for their support, and I want to thank all the musicians involved and technicians involved who made this wonderful festival a success.
Hello again. Thank you for watching. On behalf of the Board of Directors, we hope you enjoyed this presentation and we hope you stay tuned for all of them. Please visit our website. Become a member. Your support will help us produce more events featuring some of the great musicians in our area.
Nous voulons remercier Patrimoine canadien et la ville de Nanaimo pour leur soutien financier qui facilite le continu d'événements culturels et artistiques. Bon spectacle et à très bientôt!